Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. Thank you for downloading. My name is Archisman Chaudhuri, a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Ocean World Center, or IOWC, at McGill University. We have two guests here today who are going to discuss their recently published co-edited volume, Animal Trade Histories in the Indian Ocean World, which they edited with Professor Gwyn Campbell and is published in the Palgrave series in Indian Ocean World Studies. Our first guest is Martha Chaiklin, a historian based in Maryland, USA. Professor Chaiklin received her PhD from Leiden University and has published several works related to animals, trade, and the Indian Ocean world. Among her most recent works are Surat, City of Ivory, which is published in a 2019 Oxford University Press volume edited by Advert Alpers and Chaya Goswami, entitled Trans-Regional Trade and Traders Situating Gujarat in the Indian Ocean from Early Times to 1900, and Imports and Otaki, Tortoise Shell in Early Modern Japan, which is published in a 2016 Cambridge University Press volume edited by Karin Hofmeister and Bernd Stefan Grew, entitled Luxury in Global Perspective, Objects and Practices, 1600 to 2000. Professor Chaiklin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Our second guest today is Philip Gooding, who you may know from previous podcasts in which he is usually asking questions. He probably needs little introduction to our regular listeners. In any case, he's a postdoctoral fellow at the IOWC, and he has published articles in the Journal of African History and Slavery and Abolition, amongst other journals. Philip, thank you for joining us and for agreeing to once again discuss some of your own work, as opposed to the work of others.
Thanks, Archisman. Great to be here.
I'm going to start with a very broad question about the nature of the book. How did it come about, and why animals? Why the Indian Ocean world, and why commerce? In short, what did you attempt to achieve from putting these themes into discussion with each other? Professor Chaiklin, maybe you could start off?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions in a short sentence, but let's see if I can handle that. So I had been working on animals since the late 90s. When working in the archives in the Netherlands, I noticed a large number of birds being imported, which was not something I had ever seen before in the literature. So when Omri organized a conference, this is Omri Basovich Frankel, he organized a conference, he held a position that you have now, and he asked me to be the keynote speaker. And the conference was so successful, we thought it should definitely be a book, but Omri ended up having conflicts, so Philip and I took over producing the book out of this conference. So why animals? I mean, I think they're a bit trendy now, but animals are fundamentally intertwined with human history. Shifting the focus from a sort of human-centered viewpoint to animals offers a distinct and essential view of the world. They shaped human interactions like diplomacy. You know, you have your panda diplomacy, or elephants being exchanged as diplomatic gifts. And animals shaped our worldview, and their pursuit impacted the environment to a pretty large extent. Economic histories tend to focus on bulk, high-value commodities like tea, silk, and spices, but animals are usually sort of one or the other. You know, you got your cows for eating, or you have something high-value like pearls or ivory, which before the late 19th century was not really shipped in bulk. So this left sort of a large gap in our understanding of the IOW and specifically, and in the world in general.
Thank you, Professor Chaiklin. I would like to follow this up now. In the introductory chapter, which the two of you have co-written, you refer to an ongoing and current debate. This debate is about the nature and causes of present-day global warming. In your discussion, you refer to ideas about the anthropocene and the capitalocene. Could you explain to us the relevance of this very current debate to a book, that it's not so much about climate change, but it's about animals, and it focuses more on history than on the present?
Yeah, so I'll take this question on. So in brief, the capitalocene contests popular notions of the Anthropocene. The latter, that is the Anthropocene, is generally understood to mean the period in which human activity has indelibly shaped global climate. And that has resulted in global warming, particularly in the last 250 years. Capitalocene scholars essentially contest this notion that it's human activity enacting global warming. It is not humans per se that create it, they argue, but a specific set of humans working within a distinct structure, that structure being capitalism. And if they want to, then in so doing, they look for the roots of capitalism, which they argue are in an agricultural revolution in Northern Europe during the late 15th century. And of course, this periodization about the birth of capitalism is in line with Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory. This period from the late 15th century also marks the beginning of the Age of Exploration, in which Christopher Columbus traversed the Atlantic to reach the Americas. Vasco da Gama went around the Cape of Good Hope. And Capitalocene scholars essentially argue that from this point on, Europeans are exporting capitalism and thereby also reshaping patterns of human-environment interaction the world over, including in the Indian Ocean world. There are several nuances here, and I urge those of you who are interested in these ideas to look at the work, especially of Jason W. Moore, especially the summaries of his ideas, which are published in the Journal of Peasant Studies in 2017 and 2018. I think the Capitalocene is quite compelling, even though in the book we can test some aspects of it. The aspects that we can test are those that relate to history and its usage in the Indian Ocean world. We argue, in fact, that human-environment interaction, and as a subset of this, human-animal interaction in the Indian Ocean world, was shaped by several factors since 1500, not just the expansion of capitalism from Europe. In the Indian Ocean world, ways of interacting with and trading animals remained robust in the face of European expansion, shaping European structures in interesting and perhaps unexpected ways. And this theme of Indian Ocean world robustness in the face of European expansion really pervades a lot of the chapters in the book as well. And I can draw your attention to a few of them. We discuss Rhea Winter's chapter, for example, which studies the exchange of live animals under the Dutch East India Company. And she argues that the VOC were, quote, the couriers of the Indian Ocean world, not the principal traders, demanders, or suppliers of goods. Rather, they were integrated into Indian Ocean world systems. Similarly, Sam Ostroff documents the English East India Company's difficulty in demarcating space and sovereignty in the purling regions of the Mannar Strait between South India and Sri Lanka. Sundar Vladimudi focuses on the same region and shows how Tamil Muslim conch shell divers and traders usurped English/British regulations in the early 19th century. Similarly, William Clarence Smith examines the history of trades of the humble donkey, which he argues were shaped by Indian Ocean world cultural and ecological constraints. And I can also draw your attention to Alicia Spray and Ken Hall's chapter, in which they examine the role of Ayataya's kings in their ongoing control and influence over the deerskin trade to Japan, despite VOC attempts at interference in the 17th century. This is not an exhaustive list of the chapters, but I do urge listeners to check these chapters out and the other ones in the book. But in sum, they show that the idea of the capitalist seems to be somewhat Eurocentric and presentist in its portrayal of history in the Indian Ocean world.
Thank you, Philip. I'm now going to ask you questions about your two standalone chapters. I will start with a question to you, Philip, because your chapter comes first in the book. For instance, on page 248 of your chapter on the ivory trade in 19th century East Africa, you write, if in the following pages, elephants and even ivory gradually become obscured behind a more human-focused history, it is for good reason. What are the reasons here? Why, in a book that focuses on animals, do animals and their products become obscured?
Thanks, Archisman. There are a couple of things going on here. Firstly, the obvious one is sources. And I think this is a problem that is encountered by many historians or social sciences focusing on animals. I rely on 19th century sources written mostly by Europeans who are mostly explorers or missionaries. They rarely discussed the lives of animals, and when they did, actually they got some things wrong, which subsequent scientific research has shown to be wrong. The most famous in this context is the idea of the ivory frontier. This was the idea that traders from the Indian Ocean coast went into the interior of Africa, and as they did, they depopulated the regions they encountered of elephants. And they went further and further into the interior, basically to find more elephants. This has been debunked. Actually, ivory was being traded from the deep interior since long before traders came from the coast. And also elephants continue to survive in regions around where traders from the coast lived throughout the 19th century. Thus, this is basically to say that animals and elephants are very much obscured in the archive, despite my best attempts to draw readers' attention to the experiences of elephants via different methods of hunting, for example. The second thing going on here, as for why elephants and even ivory become a little bit obscured, is because of periodization. The second half of the 19th century was the period in world history when East Africa really became integrated into the world economy for the first time. It's the first time when it's really influenced by capitalism. This can be seen, and this is the main driver in this context, was the demand for ivory. This started in South Asia with an increased demand for African ivory to make ivory products. But especially it applied to increased demand in America and Europe for billiard balls and piano keys. East African ivory was demanded over South Asian ivory in this context. It is softer and therefore, I suppose, less liable to cracking under the industrialized process. And also it's generally bigger. And this was incredibly important for making things like bangles, which are made from like the cross-section of an elephant's tusk, and for billiard balls, which are essentially made from the middle of the tusk. Thus, in this period, the animal, the elephant, is being marginalized by the growing world capitalist system. Elephants, I suppose, tuskers maintained a certain symbolic capital, but generally speaking, elephants were not valued as much as living beings as they were valued for their products as commodities. Human processes dominated a lot about elephant lives in this period. And my chapter shows that to a large degree by focusing on a lot of human-focused processes. There are some qualifications here to be made, and that very much relates to, I suppose, my answer to your first question about the capitalocene. It does not mean that Europeans, Americans, or capitalism were hegemonic here. East African ivory trade was mediated between Indian financiers, Omani and African traders, and African porters and elephant hunters. These distinctly Indian Ocean world influences shaped the ivory trade in distinct ways at the exclusion and much to the annoyance of Europeans. Their influence was such that the British, for most of the 19th century, purchased most of their East African ivory in India, not in Africa. They were reliant on Indian Ocean world networks to expand into the region. And again, I think this speaks to the robustness of Indian Ocean world networks in the face of European capitalist expansion. And this applies even in the late 19th century, right on the eve of the scramble for Africa.
Thank you, Philip. I now have a question for Professor Chaiklin. Your chapter on peacock feathers in Japan is fascinating, showing a longue durée history of peacock feathers' role in Japanese history, in Japanese relations with the wider world, and in the wider world's perceptions of Japan. You describe this process on page 279 as a complete cycle of import, absorption, appropriation, and reappropriation. For our listeners, could you please expand on what this process means?
Sure. So I came up with the phrase sort of as a way to explain why physical objects move through the world, sort of through shifting landscapes of the human mind. Because I think normally if you listen to, if you heard about a chapter about peacock feathers, you would wonder why you would even care about such a thing. So in this specific case, early modern Japan is usually defined by its isolationism, while appropriation is usually framed within the context of one dominant society taking from another. That doesn't really reflect the nuance of human interaction. So like, was Chinese culture dominant in Japan if it was willingly adopted by the Japanese, or vice versa? In the case of peacock feathers in Japan, they sort of arrive with multi-layered meanings from the transmitting culture that combine with existing beliefs about feathers. So peacock feathers were appropriated in Japan, but filtered through trading partners, and they become absorbed into sort of the cultural landscape of Japan. So when Japan is forced to open to the West through gunboat diplomacy in 1854, the then sort of dominant culture, Westerners, saw peacock feathers as sufficiently Japanese to make them a representative motive of what they call Japanism, which was the interest in things Japanese that influenced, like Impressionist art and a lot of the visual culture of the time. So despite the fact that peacocks are distinctly a creature of the IOW, they become to represent Japan. So this inspires people like Louis Tiffany to produce peacock glass, for example. And so peacocks become filtered through yet another lens to become something new yet again. And that's the cycle that I was trying to describe.
Thank you, Professor Chaiklin. That's it for my questions. Thank you to both of you for joining us today and for discussing your research. Once again, their co-edited volume is Animal Trade Histories in the Indian Ocean World, and it's out in hardback and ebook format now. A link to the book is enclosed in the description. Please recommend it to a university library near you. Thank you also to our listeners for downloading. Once again, my name is Archisman Chaudhuri, and you have been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.